Lawrence Road in Broomall, Pennsylvania was the kind of street where neighbors waved from their porches, where children rode their bicycles until dusk, and where the two churches at its heart stood as pillars of trust. It was the kind of place where screen doors slapped shut behind kids, running barefoot through freshly cut grass, where lemonade stands appeared on summer corners, and where everyone knew everyone else by name. It was 1975. The summer was hot and heavy, and in the quiet suburb of Marple Township, Delaware County, life moved at the gentle pace of a place that had never known real darkness. The Vietnam War had ended that April. America was trying to exhale. And in communities like Marple, the rhythms of ordinary life felt sacred, unchangeable, eternal. But darkness was already there, hiding behind a clerical collar, waiting for its moment. On the morning of August 15th, 8-year-old Gretchen Eleanor Harrington stepped out the front door of her home at 27 Lawrence Road. She was a bright, curious child with her whole life stretching out before her. Her father, Harold Boyd Harrington, was the pastor of the Reformed Presbyterian Church next door. Faith was the foundation of the Harrington household. Gretchen had 3 sisters, and the family was deeply woven into the fabric of their community. That morning, Gretchen was heading to summer Bible camp, a short walk up the same road to Trinity Church Chapel, the Christian Reformed Church at 140 Lawrence Road. It should have been the safest walk imaginable. A child of the church, walking to the church, on a street lined with the homes of churchgoers. She never arrived. By 11 o'clock that morning, Harold Harrington received the news that would shatter his world. His daughter had not appeared at Bible camp. No one had seen her arrive. No one had seen her along the road. The walk was barely a few minutes, a straight line up Lawrence Road, and yet somewhere between her front door and the church steps, Gretchen had disappeared. Harold called the Marple Township Police Department immediately, his voice steady with the practiced calm of a man who comforted others for a living, but trembling beneath the surface with a terror no sermon had prepared him for. Within hours, a full-scale search was underway. Neighbors formed search parties, fanning out through yards and alleys and the surrounding woodland. Police canvassed the area with growing urgency. Flyers were printed. Volunteers knocked on every door. The entire community held its breath, praying for the return of one of their own. But Gretchen Harrington had vanished without a trace. In the days that followed, the investigation turned frantic. Helicopters circled overhead. Volunteers combed through the wooded areas surrounding Broomall. Local news stations carried Gretchen's photograph on every broadcast, her smiling face becoming a symbol of every parent's worst nightmare. Marple Township was a place where people left their doors unlocked, where children walked freely, and where the word stranger rarely carried menace. The idea that someone could take a child from this quiet street in broad daylight was almost incomprehensible. Detectives went door to door. They spoke to every family on Lawrence Road, every member of both churches, every person who might have seen something that August morning. Among those interviewed was David Zandstra, the pastor of Trinity Church Chapel, the very church where Gretchen had been heading. Zandstra was a familiar figure in the community, a man entrusted with the spiritual guidance of families, including the Harringtons. In fact, Gretchen was best friends with one of Zandstra's own daughters. She had slept over at his house. She had played in his yard. She trusted him the way any child trusts the adults in her world. Police spoke with Zandstra on August 19th, just 4 days after Gretchen vanished. He told them that he had picked up some children and driven them to the church that morning, but he denied having seen Gretchen. He was interviewed again on October 30th. His story remained the same. 2 months passed. The summer heat gave way to the crisp bite of autumn. Leaves turned amber and crimson across Delaware County, and the search for Gretchen Harrington had long since shifted from rescue to recovery. Hope had been replaced by dread, and dread by a numb, persistent grief. Then, on October 14th, 1975, a jogger running through the wooded trails of Ridley Creek State Park in nearby Edgemont Township made a grim discovery. In a secluded stretch of forest, skeletal remains lay scattered among the undergrowth, roughly 2.5 miles from the Harrington home. The scene was deeply unsettling. Beside the remains, the child's clothing had been folded neatly, almost deliberately, as if placed there with care. But her undergarments had been removed and hung on a nearby tree branch, a detail so disturbing and so deliberate it would haunt investigators for decades. The remains were identified as those of Gretchen Harrington. The medical examiner determined that she had died from blunt force trauma to the head, specifically 2 or more impacts to the skull. She had been beaten to death. She was 8 years old. The discovery confirmed the community's worst fears. This was not a runaway child. This was not an accident. An 8-year-old girl had been abducted, brutalized, and murdered in the heart of their peaceful suburb. The case officially became a homicide investigation, and it would go on to consume the lives of everyone it touched. But despite the horror of the crime and the intensity of the investigation, no arrests were made. Leads dried up. Witnesses had little to offer. Physical evidence from the scene, degraded by 2 months of exposure to rain and sun and the slow decay of autumn, was limited. Whatever trace evidence might have existed had been consumed by time and weather. And so the case went cold. 1 year passed. Then 5. Then 10. Then 20. The Harrington family mourned in the shadow of unanswered questions. Harold Harrington continued to lead his congregation, standing before his flock each Sunday, delivering sermons about faith and forgiveness, while carrying the unbearable weight of a father who could not protect his child and could not find her killer. Every Sunday, he looked out at the faces of his parishioners and wondered if one of them knew something. Every night, he lay awake with the same unanswerable questions. The murder of Gretchen Harrington created what the community would later describe as a before and an after. Before August 15th, 1975, Marple Township was, in the words of one police official, any town, USA. After that day, everything changed. Children were no longer allowed to walk alone. Parents drove their kids to school, to church, to friends' houses. The innocence that had defined suburban life in Delaware County was gone, stolen along with the life of a little girl. Meanwhile, David Zandstra quietly left Marple Township in 1976, just a year after the murder. There was no fanfare, no suspicion. He simply moved on, the way pastors sometimes do. He relocated to Dallas, Texas, where he started a new church. From there, he moved to San Diego, California, and then to Fairfield, California, before eventually retiring to Marietta, Georgia. Over the course of 3 decades, he served 5 different congregations in 5 different states, always in a position of trust, always behind the pulpit, always surrounded by families and children who placed their faith in him. No one in any of these communities knew about the dark cloud that hung over his time in Marple Township. No one questioned why he had left Pennsylvania so soon after a child's murder. And all the while, the case of Gretchen Harrington remained unsolved, gathering dust in a filing cabinet in the Marple Township Police Station. Years became decades. The world changed around Marple Township, but the wound at its center never closed. Harold Harrington grew old. He watched his other daughters grow up, marry, build lives of their own. But the absence of Gretchen was a permanent shadow over every family gathering, every holiday, every milestone. In 2021, Harold Boyd Harrington passed away at the age of 94, never having seen justice for his youngest daughter. The case files gathered dust. 2 detectives inherited the cold case and reviewed it periodically, but without new evidence, there was nowhere to go. Gretchen's 3 surviving sisters carried the loss forward, keeping their sister's memory alive in a world that was slowly forgetting. And then in January of 2023, nearly 48 years after the murder, a phone rang at the Marple Township Police Department. The call came from a woman who sounded nervous but resolute. She wanted to talk about Gretchen Harrington. She said she believed she knew who had killed her. The detectives who took the call sat up straight. After nearly half a century, they had heard this kind of claim before, and most of the time it led nowhere. But this time was different. This woman had been a child herself in the 1970s, growing up in nearby Havertown. She had been best friends with one of David Zandstra's daughters, and she carried with her a secret that had been locked away for almost 5 decades. A secret she had never told another soul. She told investigators that when she was 10 years old, during a sleepover at the Zandstra home, David Zandstra had groped her. It was an act of abuse she had carried in silence for most of her life. But it was not the only thing she remembered. She also recalled that around the same time Gretchen disappeared, another girl in her class, a child named Holly, had nearly been kidnapped twice, and the woman had put the pieces together, even as a child. She still had her diary. She had kept it all these years, tucked away but never forgotten. and within its pages, investigators found an entry dated September 15th, 1975, written exactly 1 month after Gretchen's disappearance. In the careful handwriting of a 10-year-old girl, it read, "Guess what? A man tried to kidnap Holly twice. It is a secret I cannot tell anyone, but I think he might be the one who kidnapped Gretchen. I think it was Mr. Z." Mr. Z. David Zandstra, the pastor of Trinity Church Chapel, the man who lived just up the road, the man who drove children to Bible camp. The child had identified him as a suspect nearly 50 years earlier, and no one had ever known. No adult had asked her what she knew. No investigator had knocked on her door. The words of a 10-year-old girl, written in a diary and hidden away for half a century, had finally reached the ears of the people who needed to hear them. It was as if a ghost from 1975 had reached across the decades to tap the detectives on the shoulder and whisper, "Look here." Armed with this new information, Pennsylvania State Police and Delaware County investigators traveled to Marietta, Georgia, where David Zandstra, now 83 years old, was living in retirement. On July 17th, 2023, they sat down with the elderly former pastor and confronted him with what they had learned. According to prosecutors, what happened next changed everything. It was a confession. Zandstra told investigators that on the morning of August 15th, 1975, he had picked up Gretchen Harrington as she walked along Lawrence Road toward the church. He said he drove her to a secluded, wooded area. He stated his purpose was, in his own words, to have some sort of physical gratification. When they were alone, Gretchen asked him to take her home. Instead, he ordered her to remove her clothing. The child refused. And David Zandstra, a man of God, a shepherd of his community, struck an 8-year-old girl in the head with his fist. She never regained consciousness. He checked for a pulse and found none. He attempted to cover her small body with sticks and debris, and then he drove away back to his life, back to his church, back to his family, as though nothing had happened. David Zandstra was arrested on the spot. He was charged with criminal homicide, murder in the first, second, and third degree, kidnapping of a minor, and possession of an instrument of crime. He was extradited from Georgia back to Pennsylvania to stand trial, retracing the journey across state lines that he had made nearly 50 years earlier when he fled Marple Township. For the Harrington family, the arrest was a moment decades in the making. They released a statement saying they were extremely hopeful that the person responsible for the heinous crime committed against their Gretchen would finally be held accountable. It was a guarded statement, careful and measured, the words of a family that had learned the hard way not to trust hope too quickly. But beneath the caution, there was something close to relief, the feeling that after all these years, the truth was finally clawing its way to the surface. But the road to justice is never straight, and this case proved no exception. As the trial approached, Zandstra's defense attorney mounted a fierce challenge. He argued that the confession had been coerced, that investigators had used deceptive tactics to manipulate an elderly man into admitting to a crime he did not commit. The evidence supported this claim in troubling ways. The lead detective had lied to Zandstra during the interview, telling him that forensic evidence linked him to Gretchen's disappearance. That was false. The detective told Zandstra that they had an eyewitness who saw Gretchen get into his car. That too was fabricated. He claimed they had found her DNA on rocks at the site where her body was discovered. Another lie. And perhaps most damaging of all, Zandstra's own DNA did not match the DNA that had been recovered from Gretchen's clothing. The trial began on January 14th, 2025, in Delaware County. The prosecution's case rested almost entirely on the confession. Without physical evidence tying Zandstra to the crime, and with DNA evidence that actively contradicted the charges, the recorded interview was their strongest weapon. But the defense hammered at its credibility, painting a picture of a frail old man, pressured and deceived into saying what investigators wanted to hear. On January 17th, 2025, the jury delivered its verdict. After approximately 1 hour of deliberation, 1 hour to weigh nearly 50 years of grief and suspicion and circumstantial evidence, they found 84-year-old David Zandstra not guilty on all counts. Not guilty of murder, not guilty of kidnapping. The courtroom fell silent. Members of the Harrington family sat motionless, absorbing the blow. For a family that had waited half a century, the verdict was devastating beyond measure. After nearly 50 years of waiting, after the hope that had surged with the arrest, After the painful process of reliving every detail of their sister's murder in open court, the system had delivered an answer that felt like no answer at all. The acquittal did not mean that David Zandstra was innocent. It did not mean the case was resolved. It meant only that the prosecution had failed to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, that narrow but essential standard upon which the entire system of justice rests. The questions that have haunted Marple Township since 1975 remain unanswered. Who killed Gretchen Harrington? Why was her clothing folded beside her body? Whose DNA was on her garments? And if David Zandstra's confession was indeed false, then who took an 8-year-old girl from a church road on a summer morning and left her broken body in the woods? The case of Gretchen Harrington is a story of trust betrayed, of innocence stolen, and of a community forever scarred. It is a reminder that the people we trust the most, the people behind the pulpit, the people who invite our children into their homes, are not always what they seem. Whether David Zandstra killed Gretchen Harrington is a question the legal system has answered, but the answer it gave has satisfied almost no one. Gretchen Eleanor Harrington was 8 years old. She was walking to Bible camp on a summer morning on a street she had walked 100 times before. She should have been safe. She was not. And the road to her truth, paved with decades of silence, a child's diary, a contested confession, and a jury's doubt, may never reach its end. The residents of Marple Township still remember. Those who were children in 1975 are grandparents now, but they carried the memory like a scar. They remember the search parties and the candlelight vigils. They remember the flyers stapled to telephone poles, the face of a smiling girl staring out from every bulletin board in town. They remember the moment the news came that her remains had been found in Ridley Creek State Park, and the collective shudder that passed through the community like a cold wind. They remember how the world changed overnight, how the simple act of letting a child walk to church became unthinkable, how trust itself became a casualty. And they remember Gretchen, a little girl with a bright smile, who deserved so much more than the hand she was dealt. For the Harrington family, there is no closure. Harold Harrington went to his grave without seeing justice served. Gretchen's sisters carry the wound into a future that offers no healing. And somewhere in the pages of a child's diary, written in pencil by a 10-year-old hand, the truth may have been hiding in plain sight all along. I think it was Mr. Z. Perhaps the most honest testimony in this entire case came from someone who was never called to the witness stand, from a child who understood, even then, what the adults around her could not see. The darkness was never far away. It was right there on Lawrence Road, wearing a smile and a Sunday suit, waiting to be believed.